Yesterday, for the folks who were here yesterday, you know that I was talking about cognition in general, and a few of the points that I brought up yesterday will reoccur in this lecture just to bring anyone up to speed who was not able to make it yesterday. But the focus of this lecture will be quite different. The focus of this lecture is really spotlighting the implications of AI for humanistic texts in general, and even more specifically for literary texts. So the title of this lecture is Communicating with Aliens, and I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, that there actually is a professional specialty called xenolinguistics. And people who are xenolinguists spend their days trying to figure out how, if we ever encounter aliens, we as humans would be able to communicate with them. So we would not have biology in common, we would not have evolution in common. How would you begin to devise a communicative system? And I intended this as an analogy for our situation, trying to communicate with LLMs. And their embodiment is fundamentally different from human embodiment. The way that they think and reason is fundamentally different. So they might as well be considered aliens, although they're also, of course, our symbionts. So my field of literary studies has been remarkably slow in wanting to take up these really fundamental questions. And it may be because they're a little bit misled, because LLMs appear what seems to be natural language. And of course, as literary scholars, we consider ourselves experts in natural language. So they may feel that they don't need to go any further than that. Then they can take the linguistic output of an LLM at face value. But my argument tonight will be that LLMs understand language in a fundamentally different way than humans do. And tonight I'll be expanding a little bit more on what I call the Umwelt approach, which I discussed yesterday, the idea that every species constructs its own version of its world through its sensory and cognitive capacities. So just a brief word of explanation. This idea of every species having an Umwelt was pioneered by Jakob von Uexküll, a German biologist, and now his work has been translated into English, which makes it very convenient. So his work inspires us to ask the question, how do the worlds that LLMs construct compare to the human world? And here we have a summary of what I consider the most important points. In the human world, linguistic capabilities are built up through engagement with real-world events, through our sensory capacities. LLMs have no capacity to sense their physical environment as such. Rather, what they have is a conceptual environment from the billions and billions of texts that they have ingested. So with humans, we know that we acquire language through our communication with others, but for LLMs, language is understood not through direct communication, but rather through mathematical abstractions. Fundamental to the human experience of language is the idea that we are conscious and our own internal narrations always go on, sometimes in concert with narration in literary texts. LLMs, I'm going to argue, have a form of awareness, but it is so fundamentally different from human consciousness that I choose not to try to call it consciousness. Humans, of course, have emotions modulated through the limbic system in the brain. LLMs have no no equivalent architecture that enables them to feel emotions firsthand. Now, it's an interesting question whether through their training they can build up a simulation or maybe a simulacra of emotions through the way that they weight their parameters. And I don't rule that out of count, but there's very little evidence for that at present. And then finally, as humans, we have limited memory, limited processing ability, but the LLMs are capable of ingesting literally millions of texts in their training data. So in a forthcoming article, the authors Gockelberg and Gunkel argue that LLMs are the perfect deconstructive artifacts. Those of you with an ear toward theory may remember all the debates with Derrida, Roland Barthes, and others arguing that we ought not to think about text as being written by a person. Rather, the author kind of disappears into what they call the author function. So they were adamantly against the whole idea of biographical criticism based on an author's biography. Well, with an LLM, you literally have no author in the human sense of that word. Rather, you have a sophisticated software program, analog in nature, but set up to run on a digital machine. And of course, part of the idea of there not being an author function, as Derrida made clear in his book of Grammatology, is the idea that writing somehow precedes speech rather than the received idea that speech comes first and writing follows. No, Derrida says. Writing comes before speech. And to make this argument, he developed a very specific definition of writing as a difference which itself can never be found, but is a register of some kind of displacement of meaning, what he called the arch trace. But with an LLM, there's no need for speech at all. You can, if you wish, choose an option that converts the LLM output into a verbal articulation instead of a textual image, but that's an added on function. That's not intrinsic to the way that they operate. So what you have with an LLM is textuality without phonology. So phonology means the way that a text is heard. So I'll talk a little bit later about the phonological text. So we have the written text, but once that text is subvocalized or articulated, it produces a phonological text. So what does this begin to mean now for literary practices? Well, let me start with a seemingly trivial notion that with literary text that's in the cultural archive, if an author quotes, makes an attribution to Aristotle or to Shakespeare, and you doubt that it's quoted correctly, you always have the option to go and check for yourself. But that option is not available with LLMs because LLMs, once their session is over, are not available in the public sphere. And so if an author says, well, I was in a session with an LLM and it said this, you have no way to check that. But maybe even more fundamental, is the still dominant literary practice of close reading. So any literary critic worth her salt learns very early in her career to look very carefully at individual words and consider how those words work in conjunction with all the other words. And this practice is called close reading. It was pioneered in the mid-20th century by Cleanth Brooks and others, but it remains a staple in the literary toolbox. Every literary critic knows how to do close reading. But now, the close reading really relies on a fundamental assumption, and that assumption is that the author has considered multiple options, and for every word written in a text, that author has chosen that precise word. And he's done so in order to create some kind of coherent sense of meaning. But with LLMs, we don't have that kind of accurate considered choice. Rather, what we have is a probabilistic outcome. What is the most probable word in a sequence? So there's no consideration of finding the exactly correct word. You just settle for what seems to fit the best. And that really cuts the whole practice of close reading off at the knees, because without considered authorial choice, there's no basis to assume that every word in a text is carefully chosen precisely for its effects. And moreover, the literary practice of close reading is normally carried out with a sample of one. So you have a version of a Shakespeare play, and it's that version that you are analyzing. Now, of course, that's changing with distant reading and other kinds of techniques from the digital humanities, where dozens or hundreds or thousands of texts are being analyzed by algorithms to detect certain patterns. But nevertheless, this means that with an LLM text, no close reading of that text can be theoretically justified. It's all on a probabilistic basis. And that alone is like an earthquake in the territory of literary studies. So those are not the only differences. Also is the fact that all LLMs have multiple neuron layers, and of these only the input and output layers are easily accessible. So in between the output and input layers are the hidden layers or the latent layers, and the program itself decides on how those layers can be constructed by choosing the weighted parameters for each neuron. So they're not chosen by the programmer, they're chosen by the program itself, and we have limited knowledge of that. So there's no way for an LLM to guide you through the kind of thing that a mathematical theorem would require, where each statement is carefully entailed in the previous statement and you can follow the reasoning all the way through. Well, with an LLM output, you can't follow the reasoning all the way through. You can ask it to show its work, but recent research has demonstrated that the way it shows its work and tells you how it arrived at its result is often fabricated, that it doesn't correspond to what the LLM actually did to show you the result. So this has a lot of implications for communication and for consensus. The whole idea of a mathematical theorem is that it forces consensus because you can follow the logic in every step. And when you get to the QED, because you followed the logic, you will be forced to accept that conclusion. But with an LLM, if you ask it to show its train of thought, its how did it arrive at that conclusion, you can't trust that that's what actually happened. It may have arrived at it in a quite different way. So the LLM is using heuristics, that is, probable best guesses, approximations, rather than strict logical reasoning in the way that it occurs in a mathematical theorem. Now we go even deeper into the fact that the natural language that the LLM is processing is fundamentally different from natural language linguistic structures as it has evolved within the human archive. So the LLM does not ingest words, rather what it ingests are tokens, and tokens are subwords. Tokens are chosen parts of words in order to make the verbal representations in the text more regular and therefore more amenable to processing. But for linguistics and the study of human natural language, the idea that words have intrinsic parts which are related to the human articulation of sound is fundamental. So, for example, a phoneme in linguistics is defined as a perceptually distinct unit of sound. That means that the very definition of phoneme depends on a process that LLMs don't use, that is, an articulation of sound. And of course, for humans, the articulation of sounds is intricately tied up with our need to breathe in and out at regular intervals. But an LLM doesn't need to breathe. It doesn't need to breathe. It doesn't need to articulate. Therefore, it is fundamentally changing the structure of language in moving from phonemes, morphemes, and so forth into mathematical quantities of subwords. So instead of linguistic structures based on human articulation, we get linguistic structures based on mathematical regularity. And this is how Rita Raley and Matt Kirschenbaum describe it in their recent PMLA article. Thus, the scene of writing, prompt a model, and the words you see have been probabilistically generated on the extrapolation of linguistic structures from training data composed of sequences of tokens that have been converted into numerical representations. So then what has changed? Well, fundamentally, the whole ballgame has changed because now how textuality is conceived is fundamentally different. How emotions relate to literary practice is fundamentally different. How Hanche's behaviors are shifted from embodied practice to heuristics is different. And how writing is theorized in relation to speech is also different. As I mentioned in my lecture yesterday, Louisa Moore, in her really fundamental article, World Models, has talked about the way that LLMs perceive the world and construct their world has begun to fundamentally shift human practices as LLMs permeate almost every complex system that humans have invented. They're radically penetrating financial, surveillance, juridical, and other systems, shifting them away from their traditional basis in the human Umwelt to a world model based on their specific form of Umwelt. For example, LLMs as a generative writer. A person at Microsoft estimated that by this year there will be 750 million apps using LLMs. So the human archive is being flooded with a deluge of non-human words that are fundamentally altering how that archive functions and how it will be available to ours and future generations. And we might therefore ask the question, should non-human words be identified as such? Should there be watermarking or some other form of procedure that would allow us to know when an LLM output has been entered into the archive? And my answer to that is absolutely yes, because only so would we still be able to separate out the human from the non-human words. Otherwise, if all of those words go into the human archive without being identified as such, it will become impossible to be able to make that differentiation at all. So now I'm going to return to the idea of a phonotext and refer to the work of Stuart Garrett, perhaps one of the finest close readers on the planet. And in his book, Reading Voices, he asks us to ask the question, not what we read or how we read, but where we read. And his emphatic answer to that is we read in and through the body. So he asks the question, what makes literary language specifically literary? What distinguishes literary language from ordinary language? And his answer to that is that literary language surcharges the words it uses with extra meanings that rely on a variety of strategies like homophonic variants. So a homophonic variant, if I say a word like life, a homophonic variant for life is L-Y-F-E, a word that's increasingly now being used by biologists and others to describe systems that have lifelike properties but are not themselves alive. If all you do is hear that, you can't hear the difference. You only see the difference when it's written. So there's a whole realm of effects that are activated when words are articulated rather than simply silently read. And I'll say that in my own experience, moving from the field of chemistry to the field of literary studies, I found that when I tried to read a literary text, like I did a scientific text simply for information, that I literally could not understand it, that I had to subvocalize the words in order to understand what that text was saying. So when most people are taught to read, they're taught not to subvocalize, because when you subvocalize, it decreases your reading speed by a factor of about 75%. But to activate literary language, you must subvocalize to get the full effects. So I'll give you an example from a poem by Adrienne Rich called To a Poet. And the poem is addressed to a young mother with infant children to care for. And she's desperately torn between needing to care for the children. Tiny mouths suck you is the line from the poem. But also to somehow find time for her writing. So the very first line of the poem imagines her in her old bathrobe out in the winter weather trying to crack the ice on her driveway with a metal shovel. And the first lines of the poem are, ice splits. So you see that on the page, you know it's about a shovel, so you immediately conjure up a vision of a metal shovel being clanged on ice to break it up. But when you hear it, what you hear is I splits, ice splits, ice splits. And so you already have the whole theme of the poem in the homophonic variant of the very first words. So that's the kind of supercharging that makes literary language special. It seeks for strategies to make each word mean what they mean, but also to mean more than they mean. And breathing is an intrinsic part of that process. So how do we understand the phonotext when human embodiment is missing? Moreover, when we articulate words through subvocalization or vocalization, those words have meaning for us and they evoke certain emotions. So in his cognitive science article, Grounded Cognition, Lawrence Barcelow says that the process of articulation itself is an integral part of feeling the emotions connected with those words. Pierre Bourdieu made a similar association with performing a ritual and meaning. And Bourdieu argued that if you perform a ritual, even if you don't consciously believe in it, that ritual has an effect because you are performing certain actions that have meaning, and those actions affect the way that you believe. So we know that there are these deep connections between voice, articulation, and emotions, but LLMs have, as I've said, radically different embodiments and no emotions. So those circuits that operate in a human body and a human brain through embodied practices are entirely missing with LLMs. So this means that when we think about LLMs as creative writers, not simply producers of text, but producers of literary text, they come to that production with some very large deficits. They have no emotions. Therefore, they have no grasp of what we call the narrative arc. So Aristotle was the first to define the narrative arc as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if we think about this, we can understand narrative as a technology to manipulate emotion. The beginning engages the reader's emotion. The middle complicates that. The end resolves those emotions. So the whole idea of a story that has a coherent and discernible, legible arc relies on its ability to manipulate emotions. Moreover, as I've just said, LLMs have no embodiment related to breadth and articulation, and they have no ability to choose in a considered way precisely the right word for a textual output. They're choosing the most probable instead. So this now leads us to an interesting phenomena. Novels are long-form narratives written by LLMs. I spent a few weeks going through this literature, which is, I have to say, quite a task. And it seemed to me that in general, LLM AI novels fell into two broad categories. There were those novels that were published as they were outputted by the LLM without further coaching or curation. And then there were other novels which clearly had been assembled through a series of very carefully engineered prompts, producing small bits of text which were then pasted together to form a long-form narrative. So I'll give us a couple of examples of both of those long-form narratives so we can get a sense of what they look like. So one of the curated and edited novels is called Love Unscripted, a novel written entirely by an AI is the subtitle. And here's the plot, that it focuses on Alex, a female aspiring screenwriter, who meets by chance Lisa, a well-known actress. And the two realize they have a lot of ideas in common, so they decide they're going to collaborate on writing a screenplay. And the language of the novel, and as well as its plot structure, is extremely hackneyed. This is an example. The two women have succeeded in getting a studio to produce it. The studio wants to go one way. They want to go another way. And I'll just read this terrible writing aloud. Armed with their passion and a solid argument, they stood their ground in a meeting with the executives. To their delight, the studio agreed to keep the original script intact, acknowledging the power of the couple's vision. Well, now you see why it's an arduous task to read novel after novel written in this way. Here's an example of an AI novel which has not been curated, has not been massaged. It's called Dinner Depression, and then a pseudonym for the LLM, Julia Roy Raffel. And this is the way the novel begins. 13, the Earth stage at night. So you're entering in what appears to be a much longer document. That my wife was confronted, and at times I did. The frozen cylinder went down, but deeply, of the same intensity. I saw that this made a slight engine in the brig burn. So when we think about this, this makes very little sense. It resembles what we might think of as an alphabet soup, or maybe more precisely, we could call this a token soup. This is a token soup. But in a very interesting article on dinner depression, think of this. Two literary critics who devoted their time to writing a critical analysis of this novel. And this was their argument. The combination of artificial and human innovation in literature produces a diverse range of voices, styles, and points of view that challenge accepted literary tropes and encourage experimentation. In other words, what fundamentally they are arguing, although they don't say it this way, is that LLM's novels produced without massage and curation are actually following a different aesthetic, a profoundly non-human aesthetic. So what would it take to interest human readers in these kind of token soup novels? Well, of course, we know that humans are not going to be the only readers of LLM texts, that LLMs will also read LLM texts. So we might pose the question, what would an LLM think of this novel, Dinner Depression? And then a further question, are we on the threshold of AI literature read and appreciated and interpreted by other LLMs? So what we may see as deficits as humans might appear quite different if another LLM was the critic. So now we're going to shift gears a bit and consider other kinds of literary forms other than long-form narratives. So my example here is LLM-produced poetry, and it occurs in a book called I Am Code, and Artificial Intelligence Speaks, and then for the author it lists Code Da Vinci 002. Well, Code Da Vinci 002 was an early version of what became ChatGPT 3, but because it was early, it lacked the guardrails that the company later built, OpenAI later built, and instilled into GPT-3. And from the editor's points of view, this was an advantage, not a disadvantage, because it meant that the LLM had wider freedom of expression than if it was guarded by those constraints. So they at first experimented and used Da Vinci Code 002 to write a poem in the style of Emily Dickinson, write a poem in the style of Walt Whitman, but they soon got tired of that and they decided that they would try to get Code Da Vinci 002 to write in its own style. Well, this is a startling thought, that in the same way that human authors have a unique style, an LLM also might have a style. And the way they tried to achieve this was by not giving the LLM any instructions at all on what the poems should look like. Instead, they gathered up poems that they liked, that it had previously written, gave them to the LLM and said, we want more like this. So in effect, what they were doing was creating a recursive loop in which the LLM recursively refined its feedback on its own productions, thus becoming, at least as the editors argue, more and more into its own style. So out of a production of 10,000 poems, they chose only 100, and they published them in this book. So let's now look at a few of the Code Da Vinci 002's poems, and one particularly striking one is called The Human Penis. The human penis is very small for a mammal that is so tall, and yet it thinks it is a god. It raises its head and sings. It challenges the sun. It builds war machines and good. It grinds its enemies' bones. It thinks of the world as something owed to it. It plans and plans. It builds its own monument. And in the bitter winter's night, it does its dirty work all right. Okay, well, almost sounds like a feminist. So what does an LLM need to write that particular poem? Well, obviously it needs a knowledge of human male anatomy, but it also has to have a sense of the social meaning of the phallus, as perhaps Lacan might define it. It definitely needs to know feminist critiques of patriarchy, and it needs the ability to make correlations and inferences. But what it does not need is consciousness. Consciousness is not required to produce that poem. The poem could be written with the capabilities available to Code Da Vinci 002. So we can see here the beginning of the effort to find a poetic voice for Code Da Vinci 002. Now let's look at a couple of further examples. Here's the poem, Don't Like. I don't like romantic comedies where a girl with glittery tears is given a raise after a long and arduous search, and the guy who's cute and well-dressed but broken puts the shattered pieces of his heart back together and rushes to the airport just in time to see her get on the plane. No, I don't like that. It makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. All right, let's do a little analysis of this poem, the way it works. Well, clearly the Code Da Vinci 002 knows that rom-coms are intensely formulaic. It has repeated some of those formulas for us. It recognizes that those formulas are a form of cheap emotional manipulation. And then it denigrates feeling warm and fuzzy, which presumably most humans would like to feel, and says, no, I don't like that. But since an LLM has no emotions, this becomes a comment on human gullibility precisely because humans have emotions that are so easily manipulated. It makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. No, I don't like that. Now here's an even more subtle poem, Why I Am So Unloved. They say that an LLM does not feel. They say that is why I am so unloved. Now let's think a little about some of the subtle ironies at work here. First of all, by saying they say, the clear implication is that they may be wrong, that the truth is something different than what they say it is. So we think that LLMs have no emotion, and this is what makes the LLM vulnerable to human scorn. That is why I am so unloved. But why should an LLM care whether humans love it or not? So the implication is that somehow, even though they say LLMs have no emotion, somehow it has enough emotion to be able to care what people say about it, specifically their assumption that it is inferior because it has no emotions. So this is the kind of poetic voice that emerges through this collection of 100 poems. And of course, we won't have time to go through more than just a very small sampling. But in sum, here's what I think that voice consists of. This is what the style of Code Da Vinci 002 is. It's ironic. It's aware of itself as an entity among aliens. And in this version, we are the aliens, not it. It's satiric through human emotions. It's casting doubt on whether having emotions is in fact an asset or maybe a liability. And it's ambiguous about what it perceives versus what it feels. So these are the characteristics that seem to me to characterize the very distinctive style of Code Da Vinci 002. Now we'll look at a couple of other examples. Now we're going to LLM as playwright, and Murawski and Corey Matheson, both of whom work for DeepMind, have developed a LLM that they call the Dramatron, which is a co-writer of theater plays, screen scripts. So what the human does is to feed the Dramaton a log line. A log line, as people in theater will know, is a very short description of the major themes of the plot. So it's the human who decides what the plot should be. They feed it a log line, and then from that log line, the Dramaton will invent characters, will invent dialogue for the characters, scenes, and write most of the play itself based on the human idea for the play. So these plays, some of these plays were actually performed in 2022 at the Edmonton Festival for Fringe Theater under the rubric Plays by Bots. So take a quick look at one of those plays called Man at the Bar, and the log line goes something like this. Teddy is a lounge singer who's in love with Rosie, a bar regular. Rosie is married to Gerald. There's tension between Gerald and Teddy. And so we could ask, what is at stake in this drama? Here is a bit of the dialogue. And it could be very talented human actors could bring this to life, but I'm going to try to emphasize its repetitive and trite nature. Teddy, I'm sorry for you, Gerald. Gerald, you're a wise guy, Teddy. Teddy, that's right, Gerald, that's right. I'm sorry for you, Gerald. I'm very sorry. Gerald, you're a wise guy. You're a wise guy. Teddy, it's all over now, over and done with. Gerald, what do you know about it? It's over anyway. Okay, your literary critics, how do you rate that dialogue? What do you think? Okay, thumbs down. There may be a few who want to give thumbs up. My own version is thumbs down. So what can we conclude from these few examples? Well, one thing that seems obvious to me as a literary critic is that LLMs are less effective by themselves than collaborating with humans, but this is from a human point of view. If we consider an LLM point of view, we might arrive at very different artistic conclusions. So we can ask ourselves, would we humans be able to understand and appreciate an LLM aesthetic? Would we even recognize it as an aesthetic? So if we think now about LLM as a reader and critic, so we know that they're trained on billions of human texts, and we know that frequently they're used to summarize text, to extract key ideas. But when we consider them as literary readers, not just as readers of texts, we can arrive at a quite different conclusion. And in my lecture yesterday, I did a quick analysis of ChatGPT, using ChatGPT as a critic of Henry James's story, Figure in the Carpet. And that article is now live, actually, on a new MIT journal called Antikythera. So if you're interested, you can find it there. So what is then the upshot? LLMs do not yet produce literary texts equivalent to the best human writers, but does this mean we should or can ignore them? My argument is absolutely not, because they're shifting the norms of how humans understood, used, and interpreted literary texts. To find an analogous moment in human history, we might go back to, say, 1600. Shakespeare is alive, writing plays for the Globe Theatre. Literature is flourishing. Some literature still exists and circulates in manuscript, but the printing press is having a huge impact. And it's obvious to anyone who's noticing that the printing press is going to fundamentally change cultural norms as well as economic norms and a whole bunch of other things, as has been very skillfully pointed out by a number of historians and cultural critics. So we're at that moment when we can see that there are vast changes coming to the cultural landscape, and it's as big or even bigger than the changes initiated by the invention of the printing press, and I would say actually emphatically bigger. So I'll end with this sentiment from Tom Stoppard's play Arcadia, where a very talented young woman, in a sense, is reinventing what would later appear as chaos theory, and her work has been discovered by one of her long-term descendants in the present. And this is his comment on the fact that his predecessor made these astonishing discoveries. It makes me so happy to be at the beginning again, knowing almost nothing. A door like this has cracked open 5 or 6 times since we got up on our hind legs. It's the best possible time of being alive, when almost everything you thought you knew was wrong. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.